By the 13th of June, 1944, exactly 1 week after the Allied landings, German commanders in Normandy genuinely believed they still had a real chance to throw the invasion back into the sea. They had fought the Allies to a standstill in several sectors. They had inflicted severe casualties. Reinforcements were, on paper, on their way. By every conventional military calculation available to the men making these assessments at the time, the situation was difficult, but not yet lost. 6 weeks later, that same German army was being annihilated in a shrinking pocket near a town called Falaise, its remaining vehicles and equipment abandoned or destroyed along roads littered with wreckage, its combat capability as an organized fighting force in France effectively finished. Sit with that specific timeline for a moment, because it's the whole puzzle this documentary needs to solve. 6 weeks. Not 6 months, not 6 days. 6 weeks between a German command structure that genuinely believed victory, or at least a survivable stalemate, remained achievable, and the complete catastrophic destruction of that same army's fighting capacity in the field. What happened in between wasn't a single dramatic reversal, no one battle that historians can point to and say, this is the specific moment Germany lost Normandy. It was something more like a slow accumulation of compounding disadvantages, each one manageable in isolation, that together added up to a strategic position no army, however skilled, could have sustained indefinitely. This is the story of exactly why an army that fought bravely, skillfully, and at times with genuine tactical brilliance throughout the Normandy campaign still could not hold a single square mile of the ground it was fighting to defend. To understand why the German position in Normandy collapsed so completely despite genuinely surviving and in several sectors genuinely containing the initial Allied landings, you first need to understand exactly what surviving the first week actually meant in strategic terms, as distinct from what it appeared to mean to commanders assessing the situation in real time on the ground. German forces in Normandy had, by any reasonable tactical measure, performed considerably better during the first 7 days of the campaign than either Allied planners or, in a number of documented cases, German commanders themselves had initially expected. The beachhead had not been thrown back into the sea, but neither had it expanded anywhere close to the ambitious first-week objectives Allied planning had originally set, including the specific high-priority objective of capturing the city of Caen on the very first day of the invasion, a city that would, in fact, remain substantially in German hands for well over a month beyond that original planning target. German defensive fighting around Caen specifically, and in the difficult bocage terrain further west that this channel has already examined in considerable detail elsewhere, had genuinely slowed the Allied advance to a pace considerably below what pre-invasion planning had anticipated. This specific first-week performance deserves careful examination because the sheer scale of German resistance around Caen in particular has, in some popular historical retellings, been treated as evidence that German forces might genuinely have been capable of eventually reversing the invasion outright, had circumstances only broken slightly differently at a handful of specific tactical moments. This documentary's broader argument suggests a more sobering conclusion. However genuinely impressive German defensive fighting proved around Caen and elsewhere during these opening days, it was never at any point actually reversing the invasion's fundamental trajectory. It was at best purchasing time, and the specific question of what that time was actually being spent on from the German perspective versus what the Allies were doing with the exact same passing days turns out to be the single most important question this documentary needs to answer. This genuine tactical success, however, concealed a strategic reality that would prove over the following weeks to be considerably more decisive than any specific tactical outcome achieved during those first 7 days. Germany's actual capacity to win the broader Normandy campaign had never depended primarily on how effectively individual German units fought in individual engagements, however skillfully those engagements were actually conducted. It depended on a considerably more basic structural question. Could Germany reinforce, resupply, and sustain its forces in Normandy faster than the Allies could reinforce, resupply, and sustain theirs? And on that specific structural question, the first week's fighting had already begun revealing an answer that would only become more unambiguous and more devastating as the campaign continued. Let's examine this specific structural question directly, because it sits at the very heart of this documentary's central argument, and because the actual comparative reinforcement rates achieved by both sides over the following weeks illustrate with real numerical clarity exactly why the German tactical successes described in Act 1 never translated into any genuine strategic advantage. Allied planning for the Normandy invasion had assigned enormous priority and enormous resources specifically to the problem of sustaining and reinforcing the beachhead once established, recognizing correctly that the initial landing itself, however dramatic, would ultimately matter less than the campaign's subsequent logistics. The artificial Mulberry harbors, towed across the English Channel and assembled directly off the Normandy coast in the days immediately following the invasion, allowed Allied forces to land men, vehicles, and supplies at a rate that did not depend on capturing an intact, functioning French port, a specific engineering solution to exactly the kind of logistical bottleneck that might otherwise have severely constrained the pace of Allied reinforcement during the campaign's critical early weeks. The sheer scale and sophistication of this Mulberry harbor system deserves specific mention because it illustrates the broader Allied approach to logistics that made this entire reinforcement advantage possible. Two complete artificial harbors, each consisting of massive concrete caissons towed across the channel and sunk into position to form breakwaters, along with floating roadways allowing vehicles to drive directly from ships onto the beach itself, were assembled within days of the initial landing, representing one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the entire war, conceived and executed specifically to solve the single logistical problem that German planners had, by contrast, assumed would remain a genuine and lasting constraint on Allied capability throughout any invasion attempt. When a severe Channel storm in late June 1944 destroyed one of the two Mulberry harbors entirely, Allied forces adapted by concentrating logistics through the surviving harbor and through direct beach landings, a demonstration of exactly the kind of operational flexibility and redundancy German logistics planning, as this documentary's following paragraphs will establish, simply could not match. German reinforcement capacity, by stark contrast, faced a compounding set of severe constraints that this documentary's other coverage of the Normandy campaign has already begun to trace in specific detail. German units attempting to reach the Normandy front faced the severe, sustained aerial threat this channel's earlier examination of German tank vulnerability on open roads has already documented in considerable depth. A threat that forced German reinforcements into slow, nighttime restricted movement patterns that consistently added days, and in several documented cases considerably longer, to reinforcement timelines that German pre-war planning had never anticipated needing to accommodate. German rail networks across northern France, meanwhile, faced sustained and increasingly effective Allied bombing, specifically targeting rail junctions, bridges, and marshalling yards, a campaign conducted in the weeks before and continuing throughout the invasion itself, specifically intended to delay exactly the kind of rapid German reinforcement that any successful German defensive response to the invasion would have required. This specific rail interdiction campaign, often referred to by historians as the transportation plan, deserves its own brief examination because it represented a deliberate, carefully planned Allied strategic effort conducted months before the actual invasion, rather than simply an improvised response to the invasion once it began. Allied bombers had, notably, been the subject of genuine internal Allied debate before its implementation, with some senior Allied commanders and officials expressing serious concern about the significant French civilian casualties this bombing campaign would inevitably produce, given that many of the targeted rail facilities sat within or near populated French towns and cities.
This debate, while a genuinely important historical episode in its own right, ultimately concluded with senior Allied leadership judging the campaign's strategic value in constraining German reinforcement capacity to outweigh its significant humanitarian cost, a difficult, consequential decision that this documentary's evidence suggests did in fact produce exactly the kind of German reinforcement degradation Allied planners had specifically intended to achieve. The specific numerical comparison here, drawn from the documented after-action logistics and reinforcement records both sides maintained throughout the campaign, illustrates the scale of this disparity with real clarity. Allied forces succeeded in landing personnel and equipment in Normandy at a rate that consistently and substantially outpaced German reinforcement capacity throughout the entire campaign, a gap that widened rather than narrowed as the weeks progressed, meaning that the specific numerical and material balance of forces in Normandy shifted steadily and increasingly in the Allies' favor with each successive week of fighting, regardless of how effectively individual German units performed in any specific engagement during that same period.
While this documentary's earlier acts have focused on structural, logistical factors, it would be a significant oversight to ignore the genuine, well-documented crisis in senior German command that developed over the course of the Normandy campaign, because this crisis compounded the logistical disadvantages already described in ways that made an already difficult strategic situation measurably worse. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding Army Group B and directly responsible for the Normandy defensive effort, found himself operating within a command structure that this channel's earlier examination of German beach defense doctrine has already identified as genuinely dysfunctional at the highest levels, the unresolved disagreement between Rommel's beach defense theory and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's preference for a more centrally held armored reserve, a disagreement Hitler's own personal compromise decision had left unsatisfactorily resolved before the invasion ever began. This same command dysfunction continued and in several documented respects worsened throughout the following weeks of actual combat. The specific practical consequences of this unresolved doctrinal disagreement extended well beyond the invasion's opening days, continuing to shape German operational decision-making throughout the entire campaign that followed. Rommel and Rundstedt continued to disagree in documented internal correspondence and staff meetings throughout June and into July about the fundamental question of how German forces in Normandy should actually be employed. Rommel consistently arguing for aggressive, immediate counterattacks aimed at containing and eventually reversing the Allied lodgment before it could be fully consolidated. Rundstedt favoring a more cautious, methodical approach oriented toward preserving German combat strength for a more concentrated counterattack once Allied intentions and force disposition had become considerably clearer. This ongoing disagreement between two of Germany's most senior and experienced field commanders, never definitively resolved by any clear, consistent strategic direction from Hitler himself, meant that German operational planning throughout much of the campaign's first several weeks lacked the kind of single, coherent strategic vision that an effective defensive response would have required. Rundstedt's own removal from command in early July, following his own increasingly blunt private assessments of the deteriorating military situation reaching Hitler through channels Rundstedt had not necessarily intended, illustrates a further specific consequence of this unresolved command tension worth noting directly. Rundstedt was replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Klug, a transition that, rather than resolving the underlying doctrinal disagreement this documentary has traced, simply introduced a new senior commander who, within weeks, would find himself contending with the exact same fundamental tension between aggressive counterattack and cautious preservation of remaining strength, now further complicated by the specific post-July plot political atmosphere this documentary's Act 4 will examine in detail.
Hitler's own direct personal involvement in operational decision-making regarding Normandy specifically deserves considerable attention here because it represents one of the more consistently documented factors senior German commanders themselves identified in post-war testimony and interrogation as having genuinely and severely hampered Germany's ability to respond effectively to the developing tactical situation. Hitler retained throughout the campaign direct personal authority over the commitment of significant armored reserves, a specific bureaucratic requirement that meant German field commanders frequently could not respond to rapidly developing tactical opportunities or threats without first securing authorization that had to travel through multiple layers of headquarters all the way back to Hitler's own personal decision, a process that could take precious hours or even days at moments when the actual tactical situation on the ground was changing far more rapidly than this centralized approval process could realistically accommodate. This specific command dynamic reached a genuinely dramatic crisis point on the 17th of July 1944, when Rommel himself was severely wounded after his staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter aircraft while traveling near the front, an injury that removed, at a genuinely critical juncture of the campaign, the single German commander with the most direct, sustained tactical experience of the actual fighting conditions in Normandy, and whose specific relationship with Hitler, however strained by the unresolved doctrinal disagreements already described, had at least provided some functioning channel of communication between the front-line tactical reality and the senior political leadership ultimately controlling Germany's broader strategic resource allocation.
Rommel's wounding occurred just 3 days before an event that would cast a long, genuinely distorting shadow over German command decision-making for the remainder of the war, the 20th of July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, carried out by a group of German officers who had concluded, based substantially on their own direct assessment of the deteriorating military situation across multiple fronts, including Normandy specifically, that Hitler's continued leadership represented an existential threat to Germany's own survival. This documentary does not need to relitigate the full history of the July plot itself, extensively covered elsewhere, but its specific consequences for the German command structure in Normandy deserve direct attention, because they compounded the existing command dysfunction this documentary has already traced in ways that proved genuinely, measurably damaging to Germany's remaining capacity to conduct an effective defense. In the aftermath of the failed assassination attempt, Hitler's own trust in his senior military commanders, already limited by his consistently demonstrated preference for personally controlling operational decision-making, even in matters of considerable tactical detail, collapsed further and more completely, extending in several documented cases to active, explicit suspicion directed at commanders who had no actual connection to the conspiracy whatsoever, but whose military judgment regarding the deteriorating situation happened to align, in its basic pessimistic assessment, with views the conspirators themselves had held. The specific psychological and institutional atmosphere this suspicion created throughout the German officer corps during exactly this critical period of the Normandy campaign deserves further explanation, because its practical effects extended well beyond the specific individual commanders directly implicated in the conspiracy itself. Officers throughout the German command structure, aware that expressing genuine pessimism about the military situation could now plausibly be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty rather than simply honest professional assessment, faced a genuinely chilling effect on the kind of candid, realistic reporting that effective military decision-making requires. Several post-war accounts specifically describe a documented pattern of officers becoming increasingly reluctant to report unfavorable tactical assessments up the chain of command during exactly this period, precisely because doing so now carried genuine personal risk extending well beyond simple professional criticism, a dynamic that further degraded the already compromised quality of information reaching Hitler's own headquarters at the specific moment accurate, honest assessment mattered most. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, who had assumed overall command in the West following Rommel's wounding, found himself operating under this specific cloud of post-assassination attempt suspicion throughout the remaining weeks of the Normandy campaign, a suspicion that several documented accounts suggest genuinely constrained his willingness to advocate forcefully to Hitler for the kind of strategic flexibility, including at several critical junctures the option of a timely, organized withdrawal from increasingly untenable positions that his own direct assessment of the tactical situation increasingly indicated was necessary. Von Klug himself would, within weeks, be recalled to Germany under suspicion of involvement in the July plot conspiracy and took his own life during the journey back, a genuinely tragic and telling illustration of exactly how thoroughly the post-assassination political atmosphere had come to poison German senior command decision-making at precisely the moment the Normandy campaign's actual military situation most urgently required clear-headed, decisive strategic judgment. Field Marshal Walter Model, who succeeded von Klug in command, inherited a command structure and a broader political atmosphere within German senior leadership that had, by this specific point in the campaign, already been severely damaged by the compounding effects of the factors this documentary has traced throughout its preceding acts, arriving too late in the campaign's actual trajectory to meaningfully reverse a strategic situation that had, by this stage, already moved well beyond what any single new commander's individual leadership qualities could realistically be expected to salvage. If a story about how political paranoia at the very top of a military command structure can compound and accelerate an already deteriorating battlefield situation is the kind of history you want more of, take a moment to subscribe. It helps stories like this one find the people who would value them. Now, let's turn to the specific tactical and material factors that, operating alongside this command crisis, steadily ground down Germany's actual fighting capacity in Normandy week by week. Let's examine, in specific numerical and material terms, exactly how the sustained fighting throughout June and July of 1944 degraded German combat capability in ways that proved considerably more difficult to reverse than the equivalent Allied losses during this same period. German infantry divisions committed to the Normandy fighting suffered casualty rates that, by several documented unit-level comparisons, rank among the most severe sustained loss rates German ground forces experienced anywhere during the entire war, including comparisons against the notoriously brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. This documentary's earlier coverage of the specific bocage terrain fighting has already traced part of this attrition in detail, but it's worth emphasizing here the specific structural problem this sustained attrition created for German operational planning more broadly. Unlike Allied forces, who could draw on the continuously arriving reinforcement pipeline this documentary's Act 2 has already described, German units suffering these severe losses had no comparable reliable source of fresh replacement personnel arriving at anything close to a matching pace. The specific quality dimension of this replacement problem deserves particular emphasis because raw numerical replacement, even where it did occur, frequently failed to restore anything close to the original combat effectiveness of the units being reinforced. German replacement personnel arriving in Normandy in the later weeks of the campaign frequently possessed considerably less training and combat experience than the soldiers they were replacing, a consequence of Germany's own broader wartime manpower strain across multiple simultaneous fronts, meaning that even units that did receive some numerical replenishment over the course of the campaign generally found their actual combat effectiveness diminished rather than restored, since experienced veteran soldiers lost to combat casualties could not simply be replaced on a like-for-like basis by hastily trained new arrivals, however numerically adequate those replacements might have appeared on paper. German armored losses followed a comparably severe pattern, compounded by the specific vulnerability to Allied air attack this channel's earlier dedicated examination of German tank losses on open roads has already documented in detail.
Tanks destroyed or severely damaged during the Normandy fighting could not, in the great majority of documented cases, be replaced through frontline repair and return to service at anything approaching the rate German pre-war planning had assumed would be achievable, both because of the specific logistical constraints this documentary has already traced, and because Germany's own broader wartime tank production, however impressive in absolute numerical terms by this stage of the war, was simultaneously being demanded by the ongoing Eastern Front fighting, a competing strategic priority that meant Normandy could never receive the full, undivided attention of Germany's total available industrial and material resources. This specific competition between fronts for Germany's finite available resources deserves further explanation because it represents a genuinely important structural constraint operating well above the level of any specific decision made by commanders actually present in Normandy itself. German High Command throughout the summer of 1944 faced simultaneous severe pressure on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, a massive offensive that inflicted catastrophic losses on German Army Group Center at almost exactly the same time the Normandy campaign was unfolding in the West. This simultaneous crisis on two major fronts meant the German strategic reserves, replacement personnel, and equipment all had to be divided between two genuinely desperate simultaneous demands, a structural resource competition that no amount of skilled command decision-making specifically in Normandy could have resolved, since the fundamental constraint was never really about how wisely available resources were being used in Normandy specifically, but about the simple fact that Germany's total available resources by the summer of 1944 had become insufficient to adequately supply every front demanding them simultaneously. The specific scale of Bagration's impact on German strategic calculations deserves brief additional emphasis because it illustrates just how severely this two-front resource competition constrained Germany's actual available options throughout the Normandy campaign. Bagration, launched within days of the landings themselves, ultimately destroyed a substantial proportion of an entire German army group in the east, inflicting losses in personnel and equipment that, by several documented comparative assessments, actually exceeded the material cost Germany would go on to suffer in Normandy itself. German strategic planners, forced to weigh the simultaneous urgent demands of both catastrophic fronts, consistently found themselves unable to commit anything close to the full weight of Germany's remaining strategic reserves to Normandy specifically, precisely because doing so risked an even more immediate and complete collapse of the entire Eastern Front, a genuinely impossible strategic dilemma that this documentary's broader account of the Normandy campaign specifically would be incomplete without acknowledging directly. This specific attrition dynamic, Germany losing trained, experienced soldiers and equipment at a rate its available replacement systems simply could not match, while Allied forces sustained an effectively continuous, reliable reinforcement pipeline throughout the same period, represents, alongside the command dysfunction already described in Acts 3 and 4, one of this documentary's two central, mutually compounding explanations for why the initial German tactical successes described in Act 1 never translated into any genuine strategic capacity to actually hold the ground German forces were fighting to defend.
It's worth identifying, as precisely as the historical record allows, the specific point at which the accumulated factors this documentary has traced across its preceding acts crossed from genuinely difficult but still theoretically survivable into structurally untenable regardless of tactical performance. A transition that, this documentary would argue, occurred not through any single dramatic battle, but through the specific compounding operational strain of Operation Goodwood, the major British armored offensive launched southeast of Caen in mid-July of 1944. Goodwood itself, examined purely in terms of its immediate territorial objectives, achieved considerably less than British planners had originally hoped, and has consequently sometimes been characterized in popular historical accounts as a tactical failure, or, at best, a costly partial success. This documentary would suggest that this specific tactical framing, while not entirely inaccurate regarding Goodwood's immediate territorial results, misses the operation's genuinely more significant strategic effect on the broader German position throughout Normandy. Goodwood forced German commanders to commit a substantial proportion of their remaining armored reserves, including several panzer divisions that had been held in reserve, specifically anticipating exactly this kind of major British offensive around Caen, directly into the fighting around Goodwood's specific sector. Armored forces that were consequently unavailable to reinforce or counter developments elsewhere along the broader Normandy front during this same critical period. The specific scale of British commitment to Goodwood deserves mention as well, because it explains why German commanders felt compelled to respond with such a substantial proportion of their available armored reserve in the first place. British forces committed roughly 3 armored divisions to the operation, a concentration of tanks and mechanized infantry substantial enough that German commanders, drawing on their own accurate assessment of the sheer scale of the attacking force, had little realistic choice but to respond with a comparably serious commitment of their own available armor, regardless of whatever broader strategic considerations might otherwise have argued for holding some portion of that armor in reserve for developments elsewhere along the front. The specific German defensive response to Goodwood deserves brief additional mention as well, because it illustrates German forces once again demonstrating the genuine tactical competence this documentary's Act 9 will examine in more detail. German anti-tank gun positions, carefully sighted in depth across the terrain south and east of Caen, inflicted severe losses on the advancing British armor over the course of the operation's several days of fighting. A defensive performance that, examined purely at the tactical level, represented a genuine German success. The specific strategic cost of achieving that tactical success, however, the depletion of armored reserves this documentary's broader argument depends upon, proved considerably more consequential to the campaign's overall trajectory than the immediate tactical outcome of the Goodwood fighting itself. This specific consequence proved directly causally significant to the operation that followed barely a week later, the American breakout offensive, Operation Cobra, launched on the 25th of July, 1944, in the sector west of Saint-Lô, an operation this channel has already examined in considerable detail in its earlier coverage of American mission command doctrine. Cobra succeeded in substantial part precisely because German armored reserves that might otherwise have been available to reinforce the Cobra sector had already been drawn into and substantially depleted by the Goodwood fighting around Caen, a specific sequential relationship between these two major Allied operations that illustrates exactly the kind of compounding, mutually reinforcing operational pressure this documentary's broader argument has traced throughout its preceding acts. It's worth considering whether this specific sequential relationship between Goodwood and Cobra reflected deliberate, coordinated Allied strategic planning, or whether it represented, at least in part, a fortunate byproduct of two separately conceived operations happening to align in a mutually reinforcing way. The historical evidence suggests a genuine combination of both factors. Allied planners did understand, in general strategic terms, the value of maintaining pressure across multiple sectors of the German line simultaneously to prevent German commanders from freely concentrating their available reserves against any single specific threat. But the precise timing and scale of Goodwood's specific effect on German reserve availability at the exact moment Cobra launched appears to reflect at least some genuine element of favorable circumstance compounding deliberate strategic intent, a combination that, regardless of the precise balance between planning and fortunate timing, nonetheless produced exactly the kind of compounding operational pressure this documentary's broader argument depends upon. Operation Cobra's success, once it developed into the full operational breakout this channel's earlier coverage has already described in considerable detail, transformed the entire strategic character of the Normandy campaign within a matter of days, converting what had been, throughout the preceding 6 weeks, a grinding, attritional battle of position into a rapidly developing war of movement. A transformation that, given everything this documentary has already established about Germany's severely degraded reinforcement, logistics, and command capacity by this specific stage of the campaign, proved almost immediately catastrophic for the German position as a whole. German forces, already stretched thin and severely depleted by 6 weeks of the sustained attrition this documentary's Act 5 has already traced in detail, found themselves in the days following Cobra's breakthrough facing exactly the kind of fast-moving, rapidly developing tactical situation their own severely compromised command and communication structure, already documented in Acts 3 and 4, was least equipped to respond to effectively. American armored forces, exploiting the Cobra breakthrough with a speed this channel's earlier coverage has already attributed directly to the specific decentralized command culture developed under George Marshall's pre-war reforms, advanced considerably faster than German command could accurately track, assess, and respond to, creating exactly the kind of cascading, disorienting tactical confusion that German armored doctrine itself, examined in this channel's dedicated coverage of that doctrine's own theoretical foundations, had originally been designed specifically to inflict on opposing forces rather than to suffer from directly. This specific reversal deserves to be stated plainly, because it represents one of the more genuinely striking ironies this documentary's broader account has uncovered. The exact tactical dynamic German armored doctrine had been built around for over a decade, using speed and decentralized initiative to move faster than an enemy's own command structure could process and respond to developing events, was, in the specific circumstances of Cobra's aftermath, being inflicted directly on German forces themselves by an American army whose own decentralized command culture had, over the preceding months of this same campaign, proven itself considerably more capable of exactly this kind of rapid, adaptive exploitation than Germany's own increasingly centralized and politically compromised command structure could match, a genuinely fitting historical irony worth sitting with directly before this documentary moves to its final acts. Within roughly 2 weeks of Cobra's initial breakthrough, American forces had advanced deep into Brittany and had begun the specific encircling maneuver that would, by mid-August, trap a substantial proportion of Germany's remaining Normandy forces within the closing pocket near Falaise this channel's earlier coverage has already examined in detail. An encirclement made possible directly by the specific combination of factors this documentary has traced throughout its preceding acts. A German command structure too compromised by internal political suspicion and centralized authorization requirements to respond with the speed the developing situation demanded, a reinforcement and logistics system too degraded by weeks of sustained aerial interdiction to provide the fresh forces any effective counter-response would have required, and an accumulated 6 weeks of attrition that had already consumed a substantial proportion of Germany's most experienced, combat-capable units before this final decisive phase of the campaign had even properly begun. Hitler's own specific response to the developing crisis in this period deserves particular attention because it illustrates the command dysfunction this documentary has traced throughout, reaching its own genuinely catastrophic culmination. Rather than authorizing the kind of timely, organized withdrawal that several of his own senior field commanders were, by early August, increasingly urging as the only realistic option remaining to preserve any significant portion of Germany's Normandy forces, Hitler instead ordered a major German counterattack toward Mortain, an operation intended to cut off and destroy the American forces that had broken through at Cobra, rather than accepting the more defensively cautious withdrawal his own commanders on the ground were recommending.
This counterattack, launched with forces that could genuinely have been better used reinforcing an organized withdrawal, was itself defeated within days, in substantial part due to exactly the same overwhelming Allied air superiority this channel's dedicated coverage of that specific factor has already documented in detail, further depleting German armored strength at precisely the moment that strength was most urgently needed to secure any kind of orderly retreat from the increasingly precarious Normandy position. The Mortain counterattack's specific failure deserves a moment of further examination, because it represents perhaps the single clearest, most concentrated illustration of this documentary's entire structural argument compressed into one brief, decisive episode. German armored forces attacking toward Mortain found themselves almost immediately exposed to exactly the kind of sustained daylight air attack this channel's dedicated coverage of German road movement vulnerability has already traced in considerable detail. Attacks that severely blunted the counterattack's momentum within the first day and effectively destroyed its remaining offensive potential within roughly 72 hours of its launch. Ultra-intelligence, the code-breaking advantage this channel's coverage of the Battle of the Atlantic has already examined in a different context, had in fact given Allied commanders considerable advance warning of the Mortain attack's timing and objectives, allowing Allied air and ground forces to prepare a response with a degree of foreknowledge that further compounded the already severe structural disadvantages German forces faced in attempting this specific operation.
Post-war interrogation records and memoir accounts from surviving senior German commanders who fought in Normandy provide a genuinely consistent picture regarding exactly which of the factors this documentary has traced across its preceding acts these commanders themselves identified, in retrospect, as most directly responsible for Germany's ultimate defeat in the campaign, a picture that lends considerable additional historical weight to this documentary's central, structurally focused argument. Several documented senior German commander accounts specifically identify the combination of Allied air superiority and its resulting effect on German reinforcement and logistics, already examined in detail in this channel's dedicated coverage of that specific factor, as having imposed a strategic constraint that no amount of tactical skill or battlefield courage could realistically overcome, a genuinely consistent theme across multiple independent post-war accounts gathered from commanders who had no particular shared incentive to coordinate their testimony toward this specific explanation. This consistency deserves particular weight precisely because these commanders, speaking in post-war interrogation and later memoir writing afforded compared to what they could have safely said during the war itself, specifically identified Hitler's centralized, personally controlled decision-making structure and the further paralysis this structure suffered following the July plot's aftermath as having genuinely and measurably compounded Germany's already severe material and logistical disadvantages during exactly the specific weeks when rapid, decisive command flexibility would have mattered most. This specific category of testimony carries its own particular historical complications worth acknowledging honestly. Post-war German commanders speaking to Allied interrogators and later writing memoirs intended substantially for Western audiences during the early Cold War period had some documented incentive to emphasize Hitler's personal culpability specifically, both because doing so was, by this post-war political context, genuinely safe and even professionally advantageous in a way that criticizing other aspects of the broader German military or political system might not have been, and because this specific framing aligned conveniently with the broader post-war Western narrative regarding Hitler's individual responsibility for German military failures more generally. This documentary would suggest that this specific complication, while genuinely worth noting for the sake of careful historical methodology, does not fundamentally undermine the substance of these commanders' testimony regarding the specific, concrete operational dysfunction this documentary has traced in detail, given that the specific, granular operational consequences these commanders describe, delayed authorizations, denied reinforcement requests, the specific timing of the Mortain counterattack decision already discussed in Act 7, are independently corroborated by surviving German military records rather than resting solely on these commanders' own potentially self-interested post-war characterization, a distinction that matters considerably to how much historical weight this specific body of testimony can reasonably bear. This consistency across multiple independent sources, examining a genuinely complex campaign from several different command perspectives and levels of seniority, supports this documentary's broader argument that Germany's defeat in Normandy resulted not from any single decisive factor, but from the specific, compounding interaction between structural material disadvantage and genuine command dysfunction, two separate categories of problem that, operating together and reinforcing each other's worst effects throughout the campaign, produced a strategic situation that had, by the time of Cobra's breakthrough in late July, moved well beyond what any conceivable improvement in tactical execution alone could have realistically salvaged. It's worth directly addressing a specific complication this documentary's broader structural argument requires acknowledging honestly. German forces in Normandy, throughout the entire 6-week campaign this documentary has traced, continued to demonstrate genuine, often remarkable tactical skill and combat effectiveness at the unit level, a pattern that might, on its surface, appear to sit uneasily alongside this documentary's central argument regarding the campaign's ultimately structural rather than purely tactical determinants. Individual German units, and specifically several of the more experienced Waffen-SS panzer divisions committed to the Normandy fighting, achieved documented, genuinely impressive tactical successes throughout the campaign, inflicting Allied casualties and equipment losses at rates that, examined purely at the level of individual engagements, frequently favored the numerically and materially disadvantaged German defenders. This genuine tactical competence deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal, both because an honest historical account requires it, and because it actually strengthens rather than undermines this documentary's broader argument. If genuine, sustained tactical skill at the individual unit level proved consistently insufficient to change the campaign's overall strategic trajectory, that fact itself constitutes strong evidence that the campaign's ultimate outcome was being determined by factors operating at a level above and beyond what tactical skill alone could meaningfully influence. Specific documented examples of this individual tactical excellence deserve mention because they illustrate concretely exactly the kind of skilled performance this documentary's broader argument needs to account for rather than simply dismiss. German defensive fighting around Villers-Bocage in mid-June, where a small number of German Tiger tanks under the command of the tank commander Michael Wittmann inflicted severe losses on a considerably larger British armored column in a single, brief but devastating engagement, represents exactly the kind of tactical excellence at the individual unit level that continued throughout the campaign, even as the broader strategic trajectory this documentary has traced continued moving inexorably against German forces overall. Individual engagements of this kind, repeated with variations across dozens of specific encounters throughout the campaign, demonstrate genuine, sustained German tactical proficiency that never meaningfully declined over the course of the fighting, even as the broader strategic and logistical position this documentary has traced continued deteriorating steadily and irreversibly. This is, in a sense, this documentary's central and most important argument stated directly. German tactical skill in Normandy was never really the variable in question. It remained throughout the campaign at a consistently high level, comparable to, or in several specific instances exceeding what German forces had demonstrated on other fronts throughout the war. What changed, and what this documentary's preceding acts have traced in detail, was the surrounding strategic environment within which that tactical skill was being exercised, an environment defined by severe, compounding, and ultimately insurmountable disadvantages in reinforcement capacity, logistics, aerial vulnerability, and senior command coherence, against which even genuinely excellent tactical performance at the unit level could achieve, at best, a temporary localized delay rather than any genuine reversal of the campaign's broader strategic trajectory. There is a genuinely important broader lesson embedded in this specific observation, one that extends well beyond the Normandy campaign alone and connects directly to the broader analytical approach this channel's other institutional and idea-driven documentaries have consistently tried to bring to military history more generally.
popular military history frequently gravitates toward individual battles, individual commanders, and individual moments of tactical brilliance or failure as the primary lens through which campaigns are understood and explained. This documentary's evidence suggests that, at least in the specific case of Normandy, this individual battle-focused lens, however dramatically compelling it makes for engaging storytelling, genuinely obscures rather than illuminate the actual, decisive factors that determined the campaign's outcome. Factors that operated considerably above the level of any single battle, and that no amount of individual tactical brilliance, however genuine and however consistently demonstrated throughout the fighting, could ultimately overcome.
The final collapse of the German position in Normandy, culminating in the destruction of substantial German forces within the closing Falaise pocket, this channel's earlier dedicated coverage has already examined in considerable detail, represents in this documentary's broader structural framing not a separate, isolated catastrophe, but the direct, almost inevitable culmination of every specific factor this documentary has traced across its preceding 9 acts, arriving simultaneously and compounding each other's worst effects at precisely the moment German forces could least afford exactly this kind of convergent crisis. The specific timing of this final collapse deserves emphasis because it illustrates just how directly connected the various factors this documentary has examined actually proved to be in practice, rather than operating as separate, independent problems that happened merely to coincide. German reinforcement and logistics, already severely degraded by 6 weeks of sustained aerial interdiction, proved entirely unable to support the kind of rapid, large-scale repositioning that an effective response to Cobra's breakthrough would have required. German senior command, already compromised by the specific dysfunction this documentary's Acts 3 and 4 have traced in detail, proved unable to authorize and execute a timely, organized withdrawal before the closing Falaise gap made any such withdrawal effectively impossible. And German combat units, however tactically skilled individually, as this documentary's Act 9 has already acknowledged directly, simply lacked the numerical strength after 6 weeks of attrition this documentary's Act 5 has traced in specific detail to mount any kind of effective, sustained resistance against the converging Allied forces closing the pocket from multiple directions simultaneously. It's worth walking through one final time exactly how these separate strands converged in the pocket's final days, because the specific sequence illustrates this documentary's structural argument with particular clarity. By early August, several senior German field commanders, drawing on their own direct, accumulated assessment of the deteriorating tactical situation, had begun urgently recommending an immediate, organized withdrawal from the increasingly exposed Normandy position, recognizing that the specific combination of factors this documentary has traced throughout, depleted reserves, compromised logistics, and an increasingly narrow and threatened line of retreat, made continued defense of forward positions an increasingly unsustainable proposition. Hitler's continued reluctance to authorize this withdrawal in a sufficiently timely manner, compounded by the specific command paralysis this documentary's Act 4 has already traced in detail, meant that by the time withdrawal was finally, formally authorized, the window during which an orderly, low-casualty withdrawal remained genuinely achievable had already substantially closed, forcing German forces into exactly the kind of desperate, daylight, high-casualty withdrawal attempt this channel's dedicated coverage of German road movement vulnerability has already documented in detail. The specific human and material cost of this final collapse, extensively documented through both wartime and post-war sources, represented the effective destruction of Germany's Normandy fighting force as a coherent, organized military formation, a genuinely catastrophic outcome that this documentary's broader argument would suggest was never really decided in the pocket's final days themselves, but had instead been steadily, cumulatively determined
by the specific combination of structural and command factors this documentary has traced across the entire preceding 6 weeks of campaign fighting. A conclusion that brings this documentary's entire structural argument full circle back to the specific question posed by its own title.
Let's take a step back now and look at the full shape of what this story has actually been about. Because I don't think it's really a story about any single battle or any single commander's specific decision, however consequential several of the individual decisions this documentary has examined genuinely prove to be. I think it's a story about the specific, cumulative way that several separate, individually survivable strategic disadvantages can combine over a sustained period of weeks into a structural position that no amount of tactical skill, courage, or individual battlefield brilliance can ultimately reverse. Germany's defeat in Normandy was never really decided in any single week or by any single factor this documentary has examined in isolation. It was decided by the specific, compounding interaction between a reinforcement and logistics system that Allied air power had rendered structurally inadequate, a senior command structure that Hitler's own centralizing instincts and post-assassination attempt paranoia had rendered dangerously slow and dysfunctional at precisely the moments speed and clarity mattered most, and 6 relentless weeks of attrition that steadily consumed the specific, trained, experienced units Germany's entire defensive effort actually depended upon. That is the actual specific answer to the question this documentary's title poses. The Germans in Normandy could not hold their position after the first week, not because German soldiers fought poorly, and not because any single German commander made some catastrophic, easily identifiable error that a wiser decision could simply have avoided. They could not hold Normandy because the specific, structural conditions determining the campaign's outcome had already, by that first week, begun tilting decisively and irreversibly against them. A tilt that 6 additional weeks of genuinely skilled, genuinely courageous German fighting proved entirely unable to correct. There's a final sobering observation worth making before this documentary closes, one that extends the specific historical case this episode has examined into something closer to a general principle worth carrying forward. Military campaigns are rarely won or lost through any single dramatic moment that participants or observers can clearly identify while it's actually happening. They're won and lost through the accumulation of dozens of separate, individually manageable factors, compounding gradually and often invisibly over weeks, until the cumulative weight of that accumulation becomes, in retrospect, unmistakably decisive. Even though at almost every individual moment along the way, the people actually living through it genuinely believed, with entirely reasonable justification given what they could actually see and know at the time, the outcome remained genuinely undecided. If you think this specific structural way of understanding a military campaign's outcome, looking past the individual battles toward the deeper compounding factors actually determining who wins and who loses, deserves to be more widely understood, take a moment to subscribe. It's genuinely the whole reason this channel exists. And let me know in the comments, which of the specific factors this documentary examined do you think mattered most to Germany's ultimate defeat in Normandy?